At 75, the last thing I expected on a Friday night in December was the Cincinnati wind, slicing through my coat like it held a personal grudge against me. Snow hammered down from the dark sky. The cold sank deep into my bones. I stood frozen on the front porch, my arthritic hands trembling uncontrollably. These were the same hands that just 6 months earlier had crawled across the basement floor to repair their broken water heater. But tonight, those hands belonged to an unwanted old man being thrown away like garbage. The deadbolt clicked shut behind me. Edwards, my son, had just slammed the door in my face. He could not even look his own father in the eye. He simply turned away. The Maplewood house fell silent. The very house I had spent an entire lifetime working to pay off now stood warm and bright behind that locked door while I remained outside in the blizzard. At 75 years old, I watched my own son close the door on me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient reminder he wanted erased. What he did not know was this: that door closing would become the greatest blessing of my life. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories always had the chance to do the right thing. They simply chose otherwise. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the end because this story delivers a satisfaction you will never forget. Through the narrow glass panel beside the door, I could still see the warm glow of the living room. Hazel, my daughter-in-law, stood there with her arms crossed and a smug smile curling across her face. She looked victorious. To her, she had finally succeeded in removing the burden from her perfect little life. Edward stood nearby with his head lowered in silence. His weakness cut deeper than any knife ever could. Snow gathered across my silver hair. Wind screamed through the porch railing. I tightened my grip on my worn leather bag. Inside was not much. A few faded shirts, an old family photo album, and a secret I had buried for 30 years. They believed I was a broke old man, a parasite, a useless relic with nothing left to offer. Hazel wanted my room converted into a yoga studio. Edwards only wanted to keep his wife happy. To them, I was broken furniture waiting to be discarded. Neither of them had the slightest idea what I truly owned. Pain shot through my knees with every movement. I clenched my jaw and kept walking. I refused to cry. The tears would have frozen on my face anyway. Step by step, I disappeared into the snowstorm. The door to my old life had just closed. But another door, the one leading to truth, consequences, and revenge, had finally begun to open. I walked through the snowstorm, every step sending sharp pain through my body. My swollen knees burned from the freezing cold. But the physical pain meant nothing compared to the ache inside my chest. My mind drifted backward through the years. 3 long years living with my son and daughter-in-law. It was never truly a home. It was a silent battlefield. A place where I suffered death by 1,000 paper cuts disguised as hospitality. Do you know what a paper cut feels like? It looks tiny, hardly any blood at first, but it stings with a pain far sharper than expected. That was Hazel's specialty. She never screamed at me, never hit me. Instead, she slowly murdered a father's dignity with coldness, contempt, and quiet cruelty. At first it was subtle, the exaggerated sighs in the kitchen whenever I walked in, the angry clatter of dishes against the counter. Hazel constantly complained about the smell of my medicated oil, saying it polluted the clean air of her modern home. Then there was the armchair in the corner of the living room. It was the only chair that eased the pain in my back. One afternoon, Hazel bought a massive decorative plant and placed it exactly where the chair used to be. She said nothing. She simply looked at me and smiled. That smile told me everything. You do not belong here. Little by little, I became invisible. They spoke around me as if I were outdated furniture waiting to be hauled away. Edward saw all of it, every insult, every humiliation, but he always chose silence. And silence can be just as cruel as the person causing the pain. I endured it. I kept quiet for my son's sake. I did not want to destroy his marriage or bring chaos into their lives. I accepted cold leftovers for dinner. I accepted hiding away in that cramped, freezing attic room. I convinced myself that if I stayed obedient and caused no trouble, perhaps they would eventually show me kindness. But greed and selfishness have no bottom. The more I endured, the bolder Hazel became, until one unforgettable afternoon. I had walked toward the kitchen to pour myself a cup of warm water, but as I reached the doorway, I froze completely. Voices drifted from inside, and the words coming from my daughter-in-law's mouth turned the blood in my veins to ice. Behind my back, they had already prepared a cruel plan for me. Hazel's sharp voice echoed from the kitchen while I stood frozen in the dark hallway. Cold air crept up from the hardwood floor, but my chest felt even colder. She was holding a stack of bills, the papers rustling in her hands like evidence in a trial where I had already been found guilty. A presentation of my worthlessness. Hazel listed every expense with cruel precision: my medication costs, the increase in grocery bills because of one extra mouth to feed. She told Edwards that the money being wasted on me should have been spent on their children instead. Then she reached the subject that truly enraged her: me. She slammed her hand against the table when she mentioned the time I gave advice about raising my grandson. She called me an outdated old man who loved controlling people. She said she refused to let a parasite poison her child with old-fashioned thinking. And Edwards, he stayed silent. I could hear the exhaustion in my son's sigh, but not once did he defend me. Not once did he speak up for the father who had spent an entire lifetime sacrificing everything to raise him. Hazel then introduced her solution. She called it a care facility. Such a polished phrase for something so heartless. The way she described it made my stomach twist. She talked about sending me away the same way someone stores unwanted junk in a warehouse and locks the door behind it. According to her, putting me in a nursing home would free the family from stress. I stood there in silence while my heart tightened painfully inside my chest. Every word from my daughter-in-law pierced my dignity like needles. I had given them this house. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my entire life so they could live comfortably. And now in their eyes I was nothing more than a burden collecting debt and wasting space. Anger and bitterness surged through me. I could not keep pretending to be invisible anymore. I decided to walk into that kitchen. I wanted to look both of them in the eye. I wanted them to see exactly what they had become. But the moment my hand touched the doorknob, Hazel said something else. Something so cold, so cruel, that I suddenly realized her hatred for me went far beyond anything I had imagined. I shoved the door open hard enough to make both of them jump. Hazel fell silent instantly. For a split second, confusion flashed across her face, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by the same arrogant expression she always wore. Edwards lowered his head toward the floor. He could not even face his father's eyes. Deep down he knew exactly what he had become. A coward. I stared directly at my daughter-in-law and asked her to repeat what she had just said. I asked whether she had any conscience left at all. Silence swallowed the warm kitchen, but none of that warmth belonged to me anymore. Hazel showed no remorse. Instead, she stepped closer, fury burning in her eyes. "Get out, you useless burden!" Her voice exploded through the room, shattering the final fragile piece of hope I still carried about the meaning of family. She ordered me to pack my things immediately. She said she did not want to see my face in that house for another second. I turned toward Edwards. I waited for something. A single word. A protest. A hand reaching out to stop me. But my son stood there motionless, like a statue carved from stone. He had made his choice, and his choice was cruelty. My dignity was crushed beneath their feet, but I refused to beg. I turned around and walked back toward my attic room. I picked up my old worn travel bag. The truth was, I had prepared that bag 15 years ago. Ever since my wife died, I had known this day might come someday. I knew how quickly human hearts could change. I stepped out of the attic for the final time and walked through the living room. No one stopped me. No one followed. I opened the front door and stepped directly into the raging snowstorm. The wooden door slammed shut behind me. At 75 years old, I officially became homeless. Snow buried my footprints almost immediately as I wandered through the frozen streets with nowhere to go. But beneath the pain, beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, something else had already begun growing inside me. A plan. They believed they had finally removed a burden from their lives. What they did not realize was this: they had just activated a ticking time bomb. And when it exploded, the peaceful little world they had built on greed and betrayal would collapse right in front of them. Snow fell harder with every passing minute. The small town disappeared beneath the freezing darkness. I kept walking through the storm, each step feeling like punishment. My knees had swollen badly, and pain tightened through my body with every breath I took. The Cincinnati wind roared in my ears, as if it were mocking the misery of an old man abandoned by his own son. I could not keep going. My entire body trembled violently from the cold. Snowflakes clung to my eyelashes, blurring my vision until the world became nothing but white shadows and streetlights. Finally, my legs gave out beside an old car parked along the curb. I collapsed into the snow. The freezing steel brushed against my skin, but it still was not as cold as the human heart. I leaned against the tire and stared at my frail hands. Hands hardened by a lifetime of labor. Hands that had built a future for a son who now treated me like garbage. Growing old does not destroy a person through great tragedies. It destroys them through countless small humiliations. I had survived losing my beloved wife. I had survived losing my health. But what finally broke me was the cruelty of the people I once called family. They treated me like I was invisible. They threw me into a snowstorm like a bag of trash, convinced I would quietly die somewhere forgotten and alone. They believed I had nothing left. That part made me almost laugh. Slowly, with trembling fingers, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. The screen glowed weakly in the darkness. I searched through the contacts until I found a number I had not called in years. A man from my past. The only person who truly knew who I was. I pressed the call button. The ringtone echoed softly through the silent street before someone answered. Hello. The familiar voice sent warmth through my frozen chest. I fought to keep my own voice steady as I spoke. I was calling Officer Ramirez, and I told him I needed help. Ramirez recognized my voice immediately. His tone changed instantly. He ordered me to stay where I was, and promised he was coming right away. The call ended. I closed my eyes as exhaustion dragged at my body. My strength was fading fast, but inside me a spark had finally ignited. Officer Ramirez was coming, and with his arrival a secret buried for decades was about to rise to the surface. My cowardly son and vicious daughter-in-law had no idea who that man truly was, and they certainly had no idea what he was about to bring into my life. Headlights tore through the raging snowstorm, cutting across the darkness like a blade. Tires crunched heavily against the thick ice as a police cruiser slid to a stop directly in front of me. Officer Ramirez jumped out immediately. The moment he saw me sitting there in the snow, panic flashed across his face. He rushed toward me, grabbed my arms, and helped me to my feet. Without hesitation, he removed his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around my trembling shoulders. For the first time that night, I felt warmth. Ramirez guided me into the patrol car. The heat from the vents slowly eased the agony inside my frozen joints. He looked at me with disbelief and sorrow, unable to understand how a 75-year-old man had ended up abandoned in the middle of a blizzard. But with Ramirez beside me, I finally felt safe. Our connection went back decades, all the way to 1994, the year my wife died. That was the year I lost Violet, the woman I loved more than life itself. During the darkest days of my grief, a young police officer named Ramirez stayed beside me when almost everyone else disappeared. He helped me through funeral arrangements, paperwork, and the endless silence that followed losing the person who held your soul together. Over time, we became something more than friends. Ramirez became the only living person who knew the truth about my life. As he drove through the storm, he glanced at me through the rearview mirror and quietly asked about Edwards and Hazel. I simply shook my head. Some betrayals are too painful to describe out loud. Ramirez let out a slow breath. Then his expression hardened. He told me there was no reason to hide the truth anymore. Everything had already been prepared. The world was finally going to learn who Raymond Walker really was. For 30 years, I had secretly operated a charitable foundation in Violet's name, a foundation worth millions. While I lived like a poor old man inside the Maplewood house, that organization quietly changed thousands of lives across the country. I let my daughter-in-law insult me. I let my son look down on me. Because protecting Violet's legacy mattered more to me than wealth, pride, or comfort. Not once in 3 decades had I touched a single dollar from that fortune for personal gain. Ramirez pressed harder on the gas pedal, and the cruiser surged through the snowy streets. We were not heading towards some cheap motel for homeless men. No, Ramirez was taking me somewhere far more important. Somewhere the truth would finally step into the light. And that place would become the beginning of the worst nightmare Edwards and Hazel had ever experienced. Ramirez's police cruiser cut through the darkness while snow continued crashing against the windows. I stared outside as familiar streets slowly disappeared behind us. I assumed he was taking me to some cheap motel on the edge of town. At the very least, I expected a temporary place to survive the storm for one night. But instead of turning toward a hotel, Ramirez drove straight to the Westwood Community Center. I looked at him in confusion and asked why we were there at this hour. Ramirez did not answer. He only smiled. A smile filled with pride. The cruiser slowly rolled through the gates of the center, and the moment we entered the parking lot, my heart nearly stopped. I could not believe what I was seeing. Despite the brutal snowstorm, the courtyard was overflowing with people. Hundreds of residents stood beneath the falling snow, holding candles in their hands. Tiny flames flickered in the darkness, joining together into a sea of warm golden light. They were waiting for me. Men, women, children, elderly couples, all standing in the freezing cold just to support one old man who had been thrown away by his own family. The moment the cruiser stopped, murmurs swept through the crowd. And then I recognized the faces. The elderly woman who owned the grocery store down the street. The mechanic from the corner garage. The children whose school tuition I had quietly paid years earlier. 2 television news vans were parked near the entrance. Camera lights exploded across the snow as reporters rushed forward. Bright flashes illuminated the police car from every direction. Emotion tightened in my throat. For the first time that night, I realized something important. I was never alone. I had spent 30 years protecting my secret from my son, while an entire community had been protecting it for me. Everyone in this neighborhood knew who I truly was, except Edwards. They knew I was the man behind the Violet Foundation. They knew I had quietly saved thousands of struggling families over the last 3 decades. Ramirez stepped out and opened the car door for me. As I slowly climbed out, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Some people were crying openly. Others raised their candles higher into the storm. Reporters surged toward me with microphones in hand. They wanted to interview the city's mysterious philanthropist, the same man who had just been thrown out into a blizzard by his own son. Live television coverage began instantly. My face appeared on screens across the entire city. And somewhere inside that warm Maplewood house, 2 cruel people were about to experience the most horrifying shock of their lives the moment they turned on their television. If you've stayed with this story until now, do us one quick favor: subscribe. A lot of people watch without subscribing, but it costs nothing and means everything to us. Back at the Maplewood house, the living room still glowed with warmth and comfort. Hazel sat calmly, sipping a cup of hot tea, while Edward slouched on the sofa, staring blankly into space. He tried to avoid his own conscience by pretending not to think at all. The large television mounted on the wall played the late-night news. Then suddenly the anchor's voice sharpened with urgency. A breaking story. The screen switched to live footage from the Westwood Community Center. Cameras swept across a massive crowd of people holding candles beneath the raging snowfall. Then the lens zoomed in on an elderly man slowly stepping out of a police cruiser. Edwards froze. His eyes widened in horror. Because the man on the screen was me. The chyron beneath my face read, Raymond Walker, founder of the Violet Foundation. Hazel's teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered across the hardwood floor. The woman who had called me a useless burden was now watching the 11 o'clock news, discover that the burden had secretly funded half the city for 3 decades. Shock quickly turned into terror. Edwards stared at the television, like he had seen a ghost rise from the grave. The news anchor continued speaking, revealing details about the Violet Foundation, a charitable organization worth tens of millions of dollars. They talked about scholarships, shelters, food programs, medical aid, and countless community projects funded quietly over the years. Then came the final blow. The foundation's owner also possessed multiple properties across the city. And that owner was the old man they had thrown into a blizzard. Edwards sprang from the couch in panic. He barely managed to throw on his coat before rushing out the front door like a madman. Snow and wind slammed into him as he ran through the streets. The storm now sounded less like weather and more like judgment. Meanwhile, at the Westwood Community Center, volunteers and residents escorted me into the brightly lit main hall. Officer Ramirez remained at my side like a shield. Reporters crowded near the entrance while cameras continued broadcasting live across the city. Then suddenly, the glass doors burst open. Edward stumbled inside, breathing hard, covered in snow from head to toe. His face was completely drained of color. The moment the crowd recognized him, whispers exploded throughout the hall. Cameras instantly turned toward the traitorous son. If you want to see the look on a son's face when he realizes his father is a millionaire, hit like and leave a comment saying justice if you're holding your breath for the ending. Edward stared at me with trembling lips. He took a hesitant step closer, and for the first time in years, all his arrogance had vanished. In its place was pure fear, pure desperation. He opened his mouth to call me Dad. He even reached toward me as though he wanted to grab my sleeve and beg for forgiveness in front of millions of viewers watching live from home. But I never said a word. I looked at my own son with eyes colder than the Cincinnati winter outside. Then I turned away. Without acknowledging him, I motioned for Ramirez to open the door leading to the executive office in the back hallway. Panic flashed across Edwards's face as he hurried after me. What he did not know was this. Behind that office door waited a truth far more devastating than money. A truth connected to his dead mother's legacy. And once he learned it, his entire world would collapse forever. The executive office door closed behind us, instantly shutting out the noise of the crowd and reporters outside. Silence filled the room. Only 3 people remained inside. Me, Edwards, and Officer Ramirez. Edwards stood frozen in the center of the office, breathing heavily. Snow melted from his hair and dripped down his pale face. His frightened eyes scanned the room until they suddenly stopped on the massive portrait hanging on the far wall, his mother. Violet stood smiling in the painting, dressed in a golden gown, radiant and elegant. The portrait had been taken on our 10th wedding anniversary, back when happiness still lived inside our home. Edwards stared at the painting. Then he looked at me. His knees nearly gave out beneath him. I slowly walked behind the large wooden desk. In that moment, I was no longer the broken old man hidden away in the corner of a living room. I stood tall, shoulders straight, my voice firm and commanding when I finally spoke. I never spent a single dollar of that inheritance on myself. The words hit him like a hammer. I explained everything. The money had always belonged to a massive trust created by Violet's family decades ago. Before she died, Violet devoted her life to helping struggling families throughout the city. When cancer took her from us, she passed that mission to me. And I made a promise to her grave. I would protect that legacy until my final breath. I looked directly into my son's eyes. Do you remember my old worn-out coat, Edwards? Do you remember Hazel complaining about grocery bills? Do you remember the attic room? My voice hardened. I lived like a poor man on purpose. I wanted my son to build his own life without relying on wealth. I wanted to know whether he would still honor his father when there was nothing to gain from me. And now I finally had my answer. Edwards collapsed into tears. He begged for forgiveness between broken sobs. He blamed Hazel. He claimed she pressured him into everything. He pleaded with me to remember that we were family and begged me to come home. But his words sounded hollow, weak, pathetic. I stared at the son I had sacrificed my life to raise, and the emotional punishment unfolding before me felt far crueler than any revenge money could buy. Go ahead, I told him coldly. Call your wife. I could already imagine Hazel losing her mind back at Maplewood. By now she was probably tearing apart my attic room, searching for hidden checks, account statements, or proof of fortune. The same woman who once treated me like an unwanted animal was now desperately wishing she had shown kindness to the old man she threw into the snow. Edwards pulled out his phone with trembling hands. But before he could dial her number, I stopped him. Slowly, I reached into my coat pocket and removed a thick brown envelope. I placed it carefully on the desk between us. The moment Edwards saw the official seal from our family attorney, terror flooded his face, because he understood immediately. This envelope was not about money. It was a final judgment, and whatever waited inside would decide the ultimate punishment for their betrayal. I slid the brown envelope across the desk toward Edwards. His hands shook violently as he broke the seal. Inside was the revised will my attorney had finalized 3 weeks earlier. Every legal document had already been signed, witnessed, and filed. Edwards read the pages line by line. The color drained from his face. Then came the panic. The Maplewood house no longer belonged to him. It now belonged to the Violet Foundation. I stared directly into my son's terrified eyes and delivered the final verdict with a voice colder than the storm outside. Hazel called me a burden, I said. So I decided to give that burden to 30 families who actually need it. The property would be converted into transitional housing for struggling parents and elderly residents abandoned by their own families. They have 60 days to leave. Edwards completely collapsed. He cried openly, begging me to reconsider. He said they had nowhere else to go, but the mercy inside me had frozen to death the moment they threw me into that blizzard. I was never a burden. I was the foundation, and they had destroyed the strongest foundation their lives would ever have. I turned away from my son and walked slowly toward Violet's portrait hanging beside the office window. I stared into her warm eyes, and for the first time in many years, peace settled over my heart. Because this had never been a story about money. It was a love story. A promise that began the night my wife died and lasted for 30 years afterward. And now at last, I had fulfilled that promise. I protected her legacy, and I taught our son a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Behind me, Edwards quietly stumbled out of the office. He would have to return home and face Hazel's panic rage and desperation on his own. For the first time in their lives, they would have to survive without the silent protection I had provided all these years. Justice had arrived. Cold, fair, and unforgiving. This story is a reminder that karma is real. Children must honor and care for their parents. Never betray the people who sacrificed their lives to raise you. Because when that betrayal finally comes due, the consequences can destroy everything you built. If this lesson meant something to you, share this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and meaningful real-life stories. Parents may pretend to be poor to test their children's hearts, but their love and sacrifices are always immeasurable. Do not wait until you realize the value of the foundation, only to discover your entire house has already collapsed. My name is Raymond McCall, and my journey for justice ends here. Don't talk to him. He's just our butler. The words slipped lightly from Jessica's mouth, but they cut through the warm Thanksgiving dinner like a knife. I froze in place, the tray of red wine trembling slightly in my hands. 35 guests, wealthy neighbors, and my son's business partners fell silent all at once. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were an unwanted stain on their expensive carpet. I glanced at Marcus, my only son. He avoided my eyes, slowly rotating the crystal glass in his hand. Instead of standing up for the father who raised him, he stepped closer, leaned toward my ear, and whispered in a cowardly tone, "Dad, please don't embarrass us. Just go along with it, okay?" The blood in my veins seemed to freeze. In this house, I was no longer a father, no longer a grandfather, and certainly no longer a person. I was just an old piece of furniture, a ghost lurking in the corner of the room there, only to serve the illusion of their glamorous life. I suddenly laughed out loud because the man who was paying their mortgage and their credit cards was about to teach them a very expensive lesson. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a snack, sit back, and remember the people in these stories always had every chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. You're going to like it here. My name is James. I'm 65 years old. 10 years ago, after my wife passed away, I sold my chain of auto repair shops and gathered everything I owned so I could move in with my son. Marcus and Jessica kept saying they wanted to take care of me in my old age. They painted a picture of a happy 3-generation family living together in a spacious mansion worth $1,200,000. But the reality was a painful slap in the face. What they didn't know or chose to forget was that I was the one who signed the check to buy this house. They didn't know that the balance in my bank account was still growing every day, with nearly $4 million from smart investments. They saw me in the gray butler's uniform that Jessica forced me to wear, and they assumed I had nothing but dependents. Jessica was an ambitious and vicious woman. She had established a kind of military regime inside the house, where I was pushed down to live in the damp basement next to the laundry room. Every morning I had to wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast, polish the floors, and do all the chores a professional housekeeper would demand a high salary for. But to them I was free labor. At today's party, the humiliation reached its peak. I watched Jessica laughing with her upper-class friends, proudly showing off a new handbag she had bought, using the supplementary credit card connected to my account, while introducing me as some lowly stranger. Every time I tried to speak with my grandchildren, Emma and Jessica would quickly step in. She didn't want me contaminating the perfect world she had created for them. The pain didn't come from being humiliated in front of strangers. It came from Marcus's silence. My son, the child I once stayed up all night caring for when he was sick, was now looking at his father like a burden that needed to be hidden. He enjoyed the luxury funded by my money, yet felt ashamed of my presence. I turned and walked into the kitchen, placing the wine tray on the marble counter. The shame I had felt moments earlier slowly faded, replaced by a chilling calm. When your self-respect has been stripped away completely, there is nothing left to fear. I glanced at the large mirror hanging in the hallway and straightened the collar of my butler's uniform. They thought I was a senile old man, someone with nowhere to go, clinging to their mercy. They were wrong. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through the bank notification that had just arrived. Total assets, $3,782,000. Enough money to buy 10 houses like this one and wipe the arrogance off Jessica's face in a single move. This little game of pretending to be their butler had gone on long enough, and I was starting to grow tired of the role. They believed they held my life in the palm of their hands, but in reality I was the one holding their financial oxygen. One click, that was all it would take, and all that glittering luxury outside would collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. Chapter 2 will expose the rot inside this million-dollar house. It will focus on the sharp contrast between the glamorous surface and the cruelty hidden in the basement, where James is treated like an invisible man while pushing the audience's anger to its peak as the Sunset Manor scheme begins to emerge. The party ended when the clock struck midnight. The last guests left with satisfied smiles, offering Jessica their compliments for a perfect evening and for having such a devoted butler. The moment the front door slammed shut, the smile on Jessica's face vanished, instantly replaced by the cold expression I knew so well. She tossed a dirty napkin at me and snapped that I should clean up the mess in the living room before I was allowed to go to bed. I worked in silence. At 65, my joints were no longer as flexible as they used to be, but I still bent down to pick up every crumb of cookie and wiped every streak of red wine from the hardwood floor. The master bedroom upstairs once belonged to me, the place where my wife and I had dreamed of a peaceful old age together. Now it was the territory of Jessica and Marcus. And me. I walked down the narrow, steep, dim staircase that led to the basement. My room was next to the furnace and the washing machine. It was so small it barely held a single bed and an old wardrobe. There was no window, no fresh air, only the constant rumble of the washing machine through the night and the damp smell of the earth. Jessica called it a space-saving solution, but I knew the truth. She simply wanted to push me out of sight so I wouldn't ruin the elegant image of the house. The next morning I woke up to Jessica pounding on my door. She stood there with her hands on her hips, ordering me to take Emma and Jake to school because her car was in the shop. As I held my grandchildren's hands and walked them to the car, I leaned in, about to hug them the way I always did. But Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, suddenly stepped back. She looked at me with frightened eyes and said quietly, "Mom said we're not allowed to stay too close to you. She said you're a scary servant, and that your brain is broken." A child's words can cut deeper than any knife. Jessica hadn't just turned me into a servant, she was poisoning my grandchildren's minds, turning me into a monster in the eyes of the people I loved most. She was planting the idea that I was a confused old man, someone whose mind was failing so they would never respect me. It was the most refined cruelty a person could commit, stealing a grandfather's place in his grandchildren's hearts. They thought I was an old piece of furniture that needed to be thrown away. What they didn't know was that I held the combination to the very safe they had been dreaming about their entire lives. That afternoon, while I was cleaning the hallway on the second floor, I accidentally overheard a heated argument coming from Marcus's office. I was about to walk away, but the name Sunset Manor slipping from Jessica's mouth made me stop. I hid behind the thick wooden door and held my breath as I listened. "You have to sign this application," Marcus, Jessica hissed through clenched teeth. "We can't keep him here forever. He's starting to lose his mind. Yesterday he even broke the Ming vase in the living room. Do you know how much that vase was worth?" Marcus hesitated. "But that's my dad. He paid for this house, Jessica. We can't just shove him into a nursing home when he's still perfectly healthy." "That's our money now," Marcus, Jessica snapped coldly. "Just look at it, the joint account is running dry. If we send him to Sunset Manor, we can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, all of his investment portfolios and savings accounts will belong to us legally. I've already done the research. Sunset Manor is a very discreet place. They have their ways of making sure old men like him never walk out and cause trouble again." My chest tightened as I heard the long silence from my son. That silence hurt more than any insult. Marcus was thinking. He was weighing my entire life's fortune against his duty as a son. Then he sighed a sigh of surrender. "All right. But we have to do it carefully. We'll need a doctor to confirm early-stage dementia." Her words cut through the air like a blade. They were planning to use the very money I had spent my entire life building, to lock me away in a prison for the elderly, a place where I would be forgotten until the day I died. To them I wasn't a father who deserved care. I was a financial obstacle that needed to be removed. Jessica's shameless cruelty had reached a level that could no longer be tolerated, and Marcus's cowardice erased the last trace of affection I still had for him. I quietly walked down the stairs, my hands trembling with rage, yet my mind strangely clear. A plan was already beginning to take shape. They wanted to play games about legal competency. They wanted control over my finances. Fine. I would show them exactly where the true power of money really lies. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to Harold, my longtime lawyer and closest friend. Harold, I need you to prepare a few documents. It's time to activate the backup plan. And remember, keep everything quiet until the very last moment. I looked out through the small basement window where the only thing visible was the feet of people walking back and forth along the sidewalk. I had lived in the shadows for too long, endured too much, hoping that one day my son would wake up and realize what he was doing. But today that hope died. I was no longer a forgiving father. I was a millionaire protecting what belonged to me. Would Marcus choose his wife? Or the father who raised him? The answer will shock you with the cruelty of people blinded by greed. Follow my story until the end, and leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the narrow single bed listening to the washing machine rumble and the laughter of Marcus and Jessica upstairs. They were opening an expensive bottle of champagne, probably celebrating the fact that their Sunset Manor plan was about to become reality. What they didn't realize was that every sip they drank tonight would become a bitter debt they would pay for the rest of their lives. My quiet revenge had officially begun, and the first card I was about to play would be the one that would make them drop to their knees in shock. They thought they were cornering me. In truth, they were only building the walls of their own prison. This game was no longer about humiliation. It was about justice. And the justice of a man who has nothing left to lose is the most terrifying kind of justice there is. Chapter 3 will mark James's transformation from a man who endured everything into a calm, calculating hunter. We will focus on the sharp contrast between James's quiet composure in his lawyer's office and the almost ridiculous chaos that erupts when Jessica suddenly finds that her lifeline has been cut off. On Monday morning, I didn't wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast like usual. Instead, I put on the most expensive custom-tailored suit I owned one. I had carefully hidden in a suitcase under my bed for the past 3 years. When I stepped into the living room, Jessica was standing there in her silk pajamas, her face still sleepy and irritated. She was about to yell, demanding to know why breakfast wasn't ready, but the words caught in her throat the moment she saw me. I was no longer the sluggish old butler. I stood straight, shoulders squared, my eyes cold like a general before battle. Without saying a word, I walked straight toward the door. "Dad, where are you going?" Marcus called after me, his voice confused. "What are you trying to do? Start a rebellion?" I simply gave a faint smile, the kind of smile he would soon learn was the warning sign of a financial catastrophe. I drove my old car to Harold's office building downtown. When I stepped into the room filled with the rich scent of oak wood and leather-bound documents, Harold greeted me with a firm handshake. "James," he said, studying my face, "I've been waiting for this call from you for 3 years. You've been far too patient." "Let's begin, Harold," I replied calmly. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every piece of legal documentation. Legally speaking, the house Marcus and Jessica were living in was entirely in my name. The $8,000 monthly allowance they received was actually an automatic transfer from my trust fund, the platinum credit card Jessica used for her extravagant shopping. It was simply an authorized card under my account. First, I said, cut off the supply line. I instructed Harold to notify the bank to immediately stop all automatic transfers into Marcus's account. Next, cancel every authorized credit card. And finally, send them an official notice terminating their right to occupy the property. They would have 30 days to move out, unless they could pay market rent. $4,500 a month. Harold looked at me with quiet admiration. "So you're going all in?" "They think I'm a stray dog they took in," I said calmly. "What they don't realize is that I'm the one holding the winning hand." While I sat there, sipping black coffee with Harold, the storm was already beginning to hit the $1-million house. I could almost picture it. Jessica standing at the counter of a luxury fashion boutique holding designer dresses worth thousands of dollars. She would hand over her card with that familiar smug expression, and then the cashier would look at the screen and shake her head apologetically. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined. Her shamelessness was astonishing. Even when cornered, she still tried to strike back with the old dementia card. But what she didn't know was that every word she said from this point on was being recorded by the pen clipped to my shirt pocket. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it would really help if you hit like and subscribe. 97% of people never do. But that's what keeps this entire channel going. I smiled a cold, chilling smile. Don't worry about my mind, Jessica. Worry about how you're going to pay $4,500 in rent next month. Either you start looking for a smaller apartment, or you'll be out on the street. I turned and headed toward the staircase leading down to the basement. But halfway there I stopped and added, "Oh, and one more thing. Starting today I won't be making breakfast anymore. You'd better learn how to use the stove, if you can still afford the gas bill." That night, instead of the sound of the washing machine, I heard a violent argument erupting from the master bedroom. Jessica was blaming Marcus for failing to control his father, while Marcus was desperately trying to figure out how to keep their finances afloat. They were tearing into each other like animals trapped inside a glass cage. I lay on my narrow single bed and felt a strange sense of peace. This was only phase one. They thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen. What they didn't realize was that the truth about my $4 million fortune would be the thing that would truly destroy them. Tomorrow, the family meeting I had been waiting for would finally take place. It would be the day every mask was torn away, and the parasites would be forced to face the brutal reality they had created for themselves. Would Marcus fall to his knees and beg his father for forgiveness? Or would Jessica play her final card and try one last time to send James to a nursing home? The ultimate confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 4 is the moment of judgment. I will focus on the planned stair-step reveal technique, turning the living room into a courtroom where James stands as the supreme judge. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the house was thick with hostility. Jessica and Marcus no longer had their usual polished appearance. They sat at the dining table with dark circles under their eyes and stacks of unpaid bills piled in front of them. When I walked in, Jessica didn't scream this time. She looked at me the way a snake looks just before it strikes. She pushed a sheet of paper across the table toward me. It was a psychiatric evaluation request stamped by a private clinic, a place I was certain she had bribed with the last bit of money she had left. "You've gone too far, James," Jessica said, her voice trembling with anger, though she tried to sound triumphant. "We've already contacted Sunset Manor. They'll be here tomorrow morning to take you for treatment. If you're smart, you'll give us $5,000 right now to pay off these debts, and maybe I'll consider arranging a nicer room for you there." Marcus stared down at the floor and muttered weakly, "Dad, this is for your own good. You're losing control, and we need to protect the family's assets." I didn't respond. Instead, I slowly placed a black leather briefcase on the table. I opened the lock and the sharp click echoed through the silent room like the sound of a gun being cocked. I pulled out the first document. They thought I was a stray dog they had taken in, but they had no idea I was the one holding the winning hand. "This," I said, placing the paper on the table, "is the certificate of land use rights and home ownership. You say you want to protect the family's assets. Then take a good look at who the sole owner of this $1.2 million house really is. Not Marcus. Not Jessica. Me, James Pierce. And this morning I filed an eviction request with the court." Jessica's face drained of color. She grabbed the document with trembling hands, her expression shifting from pale to ghost white. Marcus's mouth fell open. But when we bought the house, you said it was a gift to us," he stammered. "A gift of use, not ownership," I replied coldly. "And that privilege ended the moment you turned your father into a basement butler. But that's not all." I pulled out the second document. "These are detailed statements from 3 different banks. My current total balance is $3,782,000. For the past 3 years, I've spent more than $300,000 just to maintain your ridiculous, extravagant lifestyle. I'm not some confused old man who needs financial protection. I'm the man who has been feeding this rotten family while the two of you played dress-up as high society." Silence filled the room. Jessica stared at the unbelievable numbers on the bank statement. The greed in her eyes suddenly transformed into a nauseating display of fake remorse. She tried to reach out and touch my hand, but I pulled away. Dad. Marcus stammered, his voice breaking. "We didn't know. We're truly sorry." We'll make it right. We'll move you back to the master bedroom immediately. I looked at my son and felt something deeper than anger. Pity. You're not sorry because you mistreated me, I said calmly. You're sorry because you accidentally mistreated a millionaire. And now I continued. Here's the final card. I placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. Jessica's cold voice filled the room. We can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, his entire investment portfolio will belong to us. Sunset Manor will make sure he never walks out and causes trouble again. Jessica collapsed into her chair, the color draining from her face. Marcus looked at his wife as if he were seeing a stranger, but I knew he was just as guilty through his silence. You were planning to use my own money to lock me in a nursing home, I asked. Every word landed like a stone on their chests. You think my mind is broken? No. My mind is perfectly clear. Clear enough to record this betrayal. I've already sent that recording along with evidence of elder abuse to my lawyer and the police. If you've listened this far, do us one small favor. It only takes a second. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it means a lot to this channel. Jessica suddenly jumped to her feet, screaming like someone losing her mind. You can't do this. You're his father. You can't throw us out onto the street. I stood up and calmly gathered my papers. There was no warmth left in my eyes for this woman. I'm not throwing you onto the street, I said quietly. I'm simply giving you the freedom you've always wanted. Freedom from my support. Freedom to earn your own living. I looked at Marcus one last time. Your car will be repossessed this afternoon. Your credit cards are dead. And by the end of the weekend, the locks on this house will be changed. You have 48 hours to pack your things. Then I turned and walked up the stairs, not down to the basement, but straight into the master bedroom. For the first time in 3 years, I walked like the true owner of this house. Downstairs, the shouting and crying erupted again. But this time it didn't bother me. The game was over, the masks had fallen, and justice, late though it was, had been delivered with the cold precision of numbers. What do you think about the way James turned the tables? Will Jessica accept defeat? Or is she planning one last move during those final 48 hours? The truth revealed in the final chapter may make you rethink the true value of family. This final chapter will be a cleansing of James's soul and a fitting sentence for the greedy. We will end this journey with a feeling of peace. Powerful and well-earned. 48 hours passed like a quiet purge. The mansion that once echoed with the fake laughter of upscale parties was now filled only with the sound of packing tape sealing cardboard boxes and the tired echoes of arguments. Jessica, the woman who once treated me like a ghost in the basement, chose the most cowardly path. Instead of kneeling down to apologize and ask for mercy, she packed up the last of her designer belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind a divorce paper for Marcus. Greed had been the only glue keeping her there. And when the money stopped flowing, she vanished like smoke. Marcus stood in the empty living room watching the taxi that carried his wife away. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. Without credit cards, without protection, he was just a middle-aged man with no real survival skills. I walked down the stairs this time wearing a simple but neatly pressed shirt. I didn't look at him with anger, but with a strange calmness. Marcus looked up, his voice hoarse. Dad, I've lost everything. She's gone. What am I supposed to do now? I poured a glass of water and placed it on the oak table that I had paid for with my own hands. You haven't lost everything, Marcus, I said quietly. You still have your hands, and you still have a name that hasn't been written in the black book of the law. I won't throw you out onto the street immediately, but you will live in the basement. Marcus stared at me in shock. I continued firmly. You'll stay in the room next to the washing machine. You'll get a job, any job, and you'll pay me $2,000 in rent every month. If you're late, even one day, the door will be locked. If you complain once you're out, this is the only way you'll find the identity of the man you lost during those years of blind indulgence. For the first time in many years, I saw Marcus cry. Not the fake tears of manipulation, but the tears of a child who had finally realized how terribly wrong he had been. Without saying a word, he picked up his suitcase and walked down to the basement, the place that had once been my home. I returned to the master bedroom and opened the windows wide, letting the sunlight pour in. I took out the photograph of my wife and placed it carefully on the dresser. I had kept my promise to her. I didn't allow our son to become completely ruined, but I also refused to let myself be trampled. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more hard-earned lessons about dignity, family, and the true cost of betrayal. My story may make many people angry, but it carries a harsh truth about life. Respect is not something you can simply grant yourself, it has to be earned. And sometimes, in order to protect love, you must learn to use the firmness of money and the power of the law. To those of you who have followed this story, I want to share a few lessons from a man who has lived nearly an entire lifetime. First, kindness without boundaries only feeds the ungrateful. Never confuse compassion with weakness. The moment you allow someone to cross the line of your self-respect, you are teaching them how to trample on you. Second, money is only a tool, but the way you use it reveals your true character. Jessica and Marcus saw the numbers, but they were blind to the value of the man who created them. Never bite the hand that feeds you, because when that hand closes into a fist, the price you pay will be total collapse. Finally, family is meant to be a place of love, not exploitation. $1 million mansion can never become a home if it is built on lies and cruelty. I looked down at the garden where Emma and Jake were playing together. I had reclaimed my right to be their grandfather. I will teach them the value of hard work, the importance of gratitude, and the truth that respect is not something you can simply claim, it must be earned. My name is James, and this is the story of my justified revenge on Dad's real-life revenge. Thank you for listening and staying with me until this final moment. Remember this in life: you can choose to be anyone, but choose to be a person of character. I'll see you again in the next stories. Just one seat at the graduation ceremony showed me exactly where I stood in my own family. It began with a phone call I was never supposed to overhear, and ended with a silence so heavy it crushed everything inside me. For 17 years, I had never missed a single milestone in Jasmine's life. Today was her graduation day at Howard University. I woke up at 5 in the morning. I carefully ironed my best shirt. I slowly tied the necktie Jasmine had given me for my birthday 3 years ago. I was proud. I was happy. I truly believed I was the luckiest father in the world. But my world collapsed right there in the entrance hall. Diane walked toward me with a cold expression on her face. She would not even look me in the eyes. She handed me a small piece of paper and whispered in a quiet but merciless voice, "You should sit in the backup seats at the back. The front row belongs to Marcus. Jasmine needs graduation photos with her real father. Having you there would ruin the perfect family picture." Her words stabbed straight into my chest. I stood frozen among the crowd. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. Seat 15. The very last row. The place reserved for unwanted guests. The place hidden behind the bright stage lights. Up front, Jasmine was smiling brightly in her graduation gown. She threw her arms around Marcus, the man who had not paid a single dollar in child support for 17 years. The man who only showed up after all the hard work was already done. "Dad, I did it," Jasmine shouted happily. And she was not talking to me. I stood there, holding a bouquet of deep red roses. I had handpicked every single flower for my daughter. Without realizing it, I squeezed the stems tighter and tighter. Sharp thorns pierced deep into my skin. Warm blood trickled down, slowly, soaking through the silver wrapping paper. But that physical pain meant nothing compared to the humiliation tearing through my soul. Had I really spent my entire life raising a child with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice, only to be treated like a stranger in the end? Welcome to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. You are going to love it here. Betrayal does not always come like a slap across the face. Sometimes it comes when the people you love ask you to step aside so someone else can enjoy the rewards of your sacrifice. I turned around and walked away. I left behind their fake laughter and hollow happiness. The thunderous applause echoing through the halls of Howard University sounded unbearable to my ears. I sat alone on an ice-cold stone bench outside the campus. The blood on my palms had already dried into dark stains. Memories from the last 17 years came flooding back like a slow-moving film, crushing my chest with every passing second. Jasmine was 7 years old that year. She came home sobbing because other children mocked her crooked teeth. Seeing my little girl cry tore me apart inside. Diane looked at me and sighed. Braces at that time cost more money than we could possibly afford. But I promised my daughter I would give her the best life I could. And I kept that promise. That was when my endless nights at the frozen warehouse began. My shift started at 10 at night and ended at 6 the next morning. I carried heavy boxes weighing dozens of pounds inside temperatures below freezing. My body trembled constantly. My fingers ached every time the weather changed. My back hurt so badly there were mornings when I could barely stand upright. But every month when I saw the savings growing little by little, I smiled. My love for this family was never built on sweet words. It was written in cold numbers on bank statements. Numbers bought with my sweat and blood. I denied myself everything so Diane and Jasmine could live comfortably and never feel inferior to anyone else. I believed my sacrifices were building a strong and loving home. But I was wrong. I was building a magnificent castle on sand. And sand always washes away. Today's betrayal was not sudden. It had been growing quietly for 17 years, fed by my own silence and tolerance. They had become so used to receiving my sacrifices that they no longer saw them as sacrifices at all. To them, my pain had become normal, expected. If you have ever felt taken for granted after giving someone everything, you had hit the like button. I slowly stood up. Then I threw the blood-stained bouquet of roses into a trash can beside the road. My patience had finally reached its limit. Did they really think I would continue sacrificing myself quietly in the shadows forever? No. My plan to reclaim justice began at that exact moment. The train of their perfect lives was about to crash downhill. The second the silent driver me finally let go of the wheel. I drove back to our house. My mind was completely numb, but my chest burned with rage. For 17 years I had lived inside a world built on cruel contradictions. I finally realized that I had only ever been the silent worker behind the curtain while someone else played the hero making empty promises. When Jasmine was 14, she dreamed of joining the city's professional ballet academy. The tuition for that prestigious arts program was outrageously expensive. Marcus showed up one evening carrying a bright red rose. He smiled confidently and promised Jasmine he would pay every cent of her tuition. Jasmine nearly exploded with happiness. She threw her arms around him, took pictures together, and posted them all over social media. Thousands of people liked the photo beneath the caption, "The best dad in the world." But 3 days later, the tuition bill arrived at our house. Marcus blocked Diane's phone number. Then he disappeared, without a trace. I was the one who quietly pushed my only motorcycle to a pawn shop and sold it to pay for Jasmine's classes. For an entire year, I walked to work through rain, snow, and freezing winds because I no longer had a vehicle. Jasmine never knew the truth. She still believed the money came from Marcus. And I stayed silent because I did not want to destroy the image of her biological father in her heart. My sacrifices had slowly turned me into air inside that house. And air is invisible. Nobody notices air until they start suffocating. Diane and Jasmine were always dazzled by Marcus's flashy promises and fake charm. They treated my sweat, exhaustion, and money as something ordinary, something expected. When Marcus bought a cheap bracelet, they treasured it like priceless gold. When I provided an entire stable life, they treated it as nothing more than the duty of a servant. This injustice had to end. Marcus's fake brilliance and their endless ingratitude had pushed me to the edge. They had no idea that the true face behind all those promises was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible. And this was only the beginning. The breaking point came when Jasmine received her acceptance letter to Howard University. The tuition was an enormous burden. And just like every other time, Marcus appeared right on cue. He promised he would take care of everything. But 1 week before enrollment, he suddenly vanished again. He sent a short message claiming his investments had failed and that he was bankrupt. Jasmine cried until her eyes were swollen. Diane nearly lost her mind with panic. And once again I stepped in to carry the weight they could not bear. I made the decision to withdraw every dollar from the retirement fund I had spent half my life building. That money was supposed to protect me in old age. My hands trembled as I signed the withdrawal papers, but my heart felt strangely calm. I believed this sacrifice would finally prove the depth of my unconditional love. I believed they would finally understand who had truly stood beside them whenever storms came crashing down. I was wrong. That retirement fund bought me nothing except a betrayal so cruel it had been planned long before I ever discovered it. 1 week before the graduation ceremony, I came home earlier than usual because of severe back pain. The house was quiet. Then I heard whispers coming from the master bedroom. It was Diane. She was speaking to Marcus on the phone. I froze in the hallway outside the door. Diane lowered her voice and said softly, "Don't worry. Everything is going exactly as planned. Once Jasmine graduates, we can finally push that troublesome old man out of the family picture. Without his money, Jasmine never would have finished college anyway. But now she has a good job in the city. He's no longer useful to us. My entire body went numb. Then Diane continued. We'll move into the new apartment Jasmine rented. You'll finally get to stand beside your daughter as the official father at all the high-class parties. And don't worry about this house. I'll force him to sign it over to me. Every word poured into my soul like freezing water. My ears rang. My heart stopped beating. The woman I had loved and protected for 17 years saw me as nothing more than a machine for money. They had waited for me to bleed myself dry so they could throw me away like a worthless rag the moment they no longer needed me. Do not scream so people can see your pain. Stand up and walk away the moment the graduation ceremony of exploitation begins. Hit like if you agree. That was the moment my patience finally died. The fragile contract called family had already been torn apart by their own hands. I did not cry. I smiled coldly in the darkness. They wanted to erase me from their perfect picture. Fine. But before I stepped out of that picture, I was going to burn the entire canvas to the ground. That night I began preparing a graduation gift that Diane, Jasmine, and Marcus would remember for the rest of their lives. I walked out of the halls of Howard University in complete silence. I did not wait for the graduation ceremony to end. I did not look back at their glowing smiles even once. That night I sat alone in my office. The room was completely dark. The pain inside me had disappeared. All that remained was a terrifying level of clarity. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls before dawn. The first call was to the property management company. I was the sole leaseholder for the luxury apartment Jasmine had rented downtown. In a cold and steady voice, I requested the immediate termination of the lease agreement. I agreed to forfeit the security deposit. The apartment would be reclaimed by the end of the month. Jasmine would no longer have a beautiful place to move into with her wonderful biological father. The second call was to the bank. I ordered every supplementary credit card belonging to Diane and Jasmine to be frozen immediately. For 17 years, they had used my money for designer clothes, luxury dinners, and glamorous lifestyles. As of tonight, that river of money had officially dried up. I was no longer the devoted husband. I was now a man, enforcing ownership over what belonged to him. The final call was to a real estate agency. The house we lived in had always belonged entirely to me long before the marriage. I instructed the agent to sell it immediately for 10% below market value. My only condition was speed. I wanted every legal procedure completed within 2 weeks. They thought I was just a foolish man who worked himself to death without asking questions. They believed they could drain every drop of my finances and casually throw me away afterward. They were wrong. I was the one who built their fake paradise with my own hands, and I could destroy it just as easily. This war had only begun, and they were still celebrating their victory, without realizing the ground beneath them was already collapsing. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises, Diane and Jasmine will receive their first brutal slap from reality. Are you curious to see how they react when they realize the gold mine they despised has officially closed forever? Stay tuned for the next chapter to witness the full force of this reckoning. The next morning, Diane and Jasmine returned home just after sunrise. I was sitting calmly in the living room reading the newspaper and sipping a cup of bitter coffee. They walked inside, looking exhausted, but their smiles still filled the room. The moment Diane saw me, she started complaining. She grumbled that Marcus had once again forgotten his wallet during their celebration dinner at a 5-star restaurant the night before. Jasmine immediately defended her biological father. A great man like Marcus should not have to worry about petty money problems, she said proudly. I did not say a single word. I simply smiled. Their awakening began less than an hour later. On her way to work, Diane stopped at her usual Starbucks for one of her expensive coffees. Casually, she swiped the supplementary credit card I had given her years ago. Beep. The payment machine rejected it. The cashier gave her an awkward smile. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined. Diane frowned in irritation and tried again. Declined. Again. This time, panic flashed across her face. Seconds later, my phone rang. The moment I answered, Diane exploded with fury. Lucas, what did you do to my account? Unlock the card. Right now I'm standing here humiliating myself in this coffee shop. My voice remained perfectly calm. There's nothing wrong with the card. I canceled it. Starting today, you can pay for your perfect little life yourselves. Then I hung up before she could scream another word. At the exact same time, Jasmine received an urgent email from the property management company. The message informed her that the lease for her luxury apartment had been terminated immediately. She was required to remove all her belongings before the 31st of the month. That was when real panic finally began spreading through both of them. For the first time in years, they realized the invisible support system surrounding their lives was disappearing piece by piece. The glamorous mask they wore so proudly was slowly being ripped away layer after layer. But this was only a light appetizer before the real punishment began. Tonight's confrontation at the dinner table would expose every ugly truth completely. Did they really believe they could corner me so easily? Then they should prepare themselves for the final audit from the man they once called the troublesome old burden. That night, the family dinner table turned into a cold execution chamber. Diane and Jasmine stormed into the house with fury burning across their faces. They slammed their hands onto the table and shouted directly at me. "Have you lost your mind, Lucas? How dare you freeze our cards and cancel Jasmine's apartment? Do you have any idea how humiliated we were today?" I did not flinch. Slowly, I pushed a thick stack of documents across the table toward them. It was the most detailed financial audit they had ever seen in their lives. I looked directly at Jasmine. My voice was as cold as ice. "For 17 years, this is the exact amount I spent on both of you. $1,240,000. Your braces, your ballet academy tuition, your expensive education at Howard University. Every single dollar came from my sweat and blood." I leaned forward slightly. Marcus made promises. I was the one who carried them out. I was the one who emptied his retirement fund so you could hold your head high beside your wealthy classmates. And yet at your graduation yesterday, both of you pushed me to seat 15 in the back row so a man who contributed nothing could stand in the spotlight. Diane let out a mocking laugh. "So now you're counting every penny you spent on your wife and daughter. That's pathetic. This house belongs to me too. You can't treat us like this." Without changing my expression, I pulled out one final document. The property ownership papers. And the completed sale agreement. I looked directly into Diane's eyes. "This house was entirely mine before we got married. And I already sold it. You have exactly 2 weeks to remove every belonging you own. The new owner takes possession on the 15th. Jasmine suddenly burst into tears. She stared at me with shock, fear, and desperation in her eyes. "Dad, are you throwing me away? Are you still my father?" Slowly, I stood up. I looked at the daughter I had once loved more than my own life. Then I answered in a low but unshakable voice. "I'm not throwing you away, Jasmine. I'm simply returning you to the place you chose for yourself. The front row beside your biological father." The room went silent. "You already planned to erase me from your family picture after graduation. I'm only helping you do it a little sooner." Diane and Jasmine stood frozen in place. Their faces turned pale. Not a trace of color remained. The brutal truth had completely shattered the fantasy they had been living in. But the punishment was still far from over, because the real question had not been answered yet. What would happen when their beloved hero Marcus finally had to face? Diane completely lost control. She screamed hysterically and tore the audit papers into pieces, scattering them across the table like falling ashes. Then she unleashed the cruelest insults she could think of. "You're a controlling monster, Lucas. You want to destroy your own daughter's future over a single seat. You're selfish." I watched the shredded papers drift through the air. Inside me, there was nothing left to shake. Diane's rage only proved one thing. They were terrified. Terrified of reality finally arriving at their doorstep. Without saying another word, I walked into my room and returned with the suitcase I had already packed. My voice was calm, cold, and final. "You have exactly 2 weeks to leave this illusion behind. Move out willingly or be forced out. Your choice. This house no longer has anything to do with me." Then I walked toward the front door. I did not look back at Jasmine's late tears or Diane's violent outburst echoing behind me. The night air in Annapolis was cold and fierce. I walked slowly down the familiar street leading toward the main road. And there, beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, I saw Marcus's polished luxury car parked at the corner. Marcus leaned casually against it, scrolling through his phone with a smug smile on his face. Maybe he was waiting for Diane to bring him the good news about the house transfer. Or maybe he was fantasizing about his glamorous future beside a Howard University graduate daughter he had never spent a single dollar raising. This time I walked directly toward him first. The moment Marcus saw the suitcase in my hand, he straightened up nervously. I looked directly into the calculating eyes of the man who had betrayed me for 17 years. Then I smiled. The bill for your perfect family is finally coming due, Marcus. His expression instantly changed. The house is sold. The bank accounts are frozen. Jasmine's apartment is gone too. So starting tomorrow, you'll be the one paying for their glamorous lifestyle. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase and stepped closer. Good luck. Marcus's confident expression collapsed into pure shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I turned around and walked away without waiting for a response. The game of switched roles was finally complete. Now the man who made promises would have to carry the full weight of two ungrateful people with empty pockets. And without my money holding everything together, the true nature of their parasitic relationship would finally be exposed. The next 6 months would become a living hell that stripped every layer of fake love away one by one. How long do you think Marcus will stay loyal once the gold mine disappears forever? 6 months passed quickly. I moved to Annapolis and settled into a quiet little coastal town. I bought an old woodworking shop and started over from scratch. There were no more complaints from Diane. No more crushing financial pressure. My hands were now covered with sawdust paint stains and rough calluses from carving wood instead of bleeding from rose thorns. For the first time in many years, my soul finally found peace. Late one evening, my phone vibrated softly. A text message appeared from an unfamiliar number, but I immediately knew who it was. Jasmine. She sent me a screenshot of a bank transfer. $500. Below it was a short message. Dad, this is my first paycheck. I'm sending you a small part of it to repay what I owe you. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you stay healthy. I stared silently at the screen for a long time. Surprisingly, I felt no hatred, no triumph either, only a strange sense of calm. For the first time in her life, Jasmine had begun to understand the value of hard work. She finally understood what it meant to earn money with sacrifice and exhaustion instead of taking it for granted. Through a few old acquaintances, I eventually learned what happened after I left. The truth revealed itself almost immediately. Just as I predicted, Marcus abandoned Diane within the very first week, after discovering she no longer had a house savings or financial security. He disappeared as quickly as he had once appeared. Marcus never wanted responsibility. He only loved comfort funded by someone else. Diane and Jasmine were forced to rent a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in years, they had to face rent payments, utility bills, groceries, and financial stress completely on their own. But the greatest punishment was never poverty. The greatest punishment was forcing them to face reality without my silent protection standing behind them. Only after the glamorous curtain finally fell did they realize the man they looked down on had been the very person keeping them from collapsing into the abyss. Every debt of loyalty and betrayal had finally been settled. But my story does not end with revenge. Because inside this small woodworking shop lies the most important lesson I want to leave behind for all of you. Stay with me for the final reflections, because if you are also living through injustice, abandonment, or silent sacrifice, you may discover the path that finally sets you free. The soft scent of pine wood drifted through my small woodworking shop in Annapolis. The golden evening sunlight stretched across the handcrafted benches I had built with my own hands. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and quietly admired my work. After 17 long years, my journey had finally ended in a silence filled with dignity. I may have lost a fake family, but I finally found myself again. Standing inside this workshop, I learned 3 painful lessons about life. The first lesson is about self-worth. Never measure your value based on the approval of ungrateful people. The second lesson is about respect. Love without respect is nothing more than a cruel form of emotional parasitism. And the final lesson is about kindness. Never allow your kindness to become an unlimited free service. The more easily you sacrifice yourself, the more people begin to treat your pain as your obligation. I looked at the simple wooden chair I had just finished building. It stood firm and strong. It was not sitting in seat 15 behind anyone else's spotlight. It belonged on a stage built by my own hands. If people refuse to give you the seat you deserve, then build your own stage. Do not beg for pity. Do not tolerate humiliation just to preserve the illusion of a happy family. My story is a warning to everyone, silently sacrificing themselves in the dark. Your silence does not make selfish people grateful. It only feeds their greed. Be brave enough to walk away once your limits have been crossed. Join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing for more real, emotional, and hard-hitting family stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I turned off the lights and closed the door to the workshop behind me. The streets of Annapolis were glowing beneath the night sky. And for the first time in many years, I walked forward feeling completely free. My real life was only beginning now. That night, the rain poured relentlessly. A runaway container truck barreled straight through the US 41 intersection. The sound of metal tearing through the night echoed everywhere. Tires screamed across the soaking wet pavement. And then came an impact powerful enough to crush everything. In the instant, my SUV rolled over the world, completely collapsed. Blood, darkness, absolute silence. My brain felt like a system that had suddenly lost power. My body was motionless. But one thing was still functioning: awareness. I wasn't dead. I was simply trapped inside my own body. I could still hear everything. I could still feel every breath. And there, on the boundary between life and death, I witnessed a horrifying truth. The machines said I was unconscious. My family said they wished I would never wake up. Both were wrong, and that mistake cost them everything. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. My name is Matt Harris. I'm a logistics coordinator. For the past 30 years, my job has been managing risks and handling incidents along transportation routes. I control every variable. I calculate every second of delay. But I forgot one fundamental rule of this industry. The worst accidents always happen on the roads you know best. Yet that very disaster helped me realize that the family system I had devoted my life to building, protecting, and operating had actually been rotten for a long time. The people I loved most were standing around my hospital bed. They weren't looking at me with concern. They were looking at me like defective cargo that needed to be cleared out to free up space. They didn't know I could hear them. They thought I was nothing more than an empty shell. They started discussing how to divide my assets while I was still barely hanging on. It was ridiculous. After a lifetime of managing global supply chains, I had allowed a pack of vultures to manipulate things right inside my own home. But they overestimated their plan and overlooked one crucial detail. The pungent smell of antiseptic flooded my senses. The steady beeping of the heart monitor echoed beside my ear. I was lying in the intensive care unit of the central hospital. Locked-in syndrome was a disgusting experience. My eyes could not open. My fingers could not move. I was like a prisoner trapped inside my own flesh. Yet my hearing had become cruelly sharp. The hospital room door was slightly ajar. I heard footsteps entering. The familiar click of high heels belonged to Sandra, my wife. Accompanying her was the head physician. I could feel her warmth as she stood beside my bed. But the words that came from her lips were as cold as ice. She asked the doctor about my condition. Her voice did not tremble. Not a single tear fell. She only wanted to know when it would all be over. The doctor explained the extent of the brain damage. He said I had a chance of waking up, but it would require time and enormous expenses to keep me alive. At that moment, I heard my wife sigh. It was a sigh filled with calculation, not despair. She lowered her voice. She told the doctor that 58 years was already a complete life. She did not want to see her husband suffer in a hospital bed. The words sounded compassionate, but in reality they were a death sentence. She was deliberately steering the doctor toward an extreme decision. Only 3 days had passed since the horrific accident at the US 41 intersection. 3 short days. That was the full extent of the patience my wife of 30 years was willing to give me. She was not waiting for a miracle. She was rushing to shut the door on my survival. The rustling of paper filled the room. Sandra pulled a document from her handbag. It was a DNR order, a do not resuscitate directive. If my heart stopped beating, the doctors would not intervene. They would allow me to die naturally. It was a death warrant disguised as loving concern. I lay there, my chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. I wanted to scream. I wanted to strangle the wretched woman standing in front of me. But my body had completely betrayed me. Helplessly, I listened to the click of a plastic pen cap. The faint scratch of a pen across paper followed. Sandra had signed it. She signed it in blue ink, the color of hope, yet she was using it to end my life. As she signed, she whispered that this was the best thing for all of us. My entire command system was clogged with rage. The woman I had devoted myself to, the woman who had spent the money I earned through sweat and sacrifice, had decided to pull the plug on me after only 72 hours. But this cruelty was merely the opening act of a much larger play. Her scheme did not involve only herself. The hospital room door opened once again. This time, the footsteps belonged to people I knew better than anyone. The real vultures had smelled the decay and were beginning to gather for their share of the spoils. The hospital room door shut firmly. Heavy footsteps entered. It was Carl, my 28-year-old son. Right behind him was Eva, my youngest daughter. They did not rush to my bedside. They did not take hold of their father's cold hand. The first thing they did was pull up chairs around the coffee table. The aroma of expensive coffee filled the room. Carl began flipping through stacks of documents. He did not ask his mother how much hope I had left. The first thing out of his mouth was a question about my bank accounts. He was reviewing my financial records. He used economic terminology to analyze his father's death. He talked about the liquidity of the inheritance assets. He calculated how long it would take to convert the house, the parcels of land, and the company shares into cash. His mind worked like a soulless computer. He wanted everything liquidated the moment I drew my final breath. Eva sat scrolling through her phone. She complained in an irritated tone. She said having to drive 20 miles to visit her father was extremely inconvenient. She was worried that this schedule would interfere with her vacation plans for next week. The daughter I had once spoiled like a princess, the one who never hesitated to demand expensive designer handbags, now viewed her father's survival as nothing more than a transportation burden. I lay there. Every word they spoke pierced my ears like sharpened knives. My chest tightened. A wave of disgust rose and lodged in my throat. My 21-year-old son had already scheduled my death into his financial plans. They viewed my life as inventory that needed to be liquidated for capital. Sandra made no attempt to stop them. In fact, she nodded in agreement with the figures Carl presented. The three people I had once called family sat together, calculating the day I would die so they could divide the spoils. They methodically and coldly assigned ownership of every car and every joint account. But this cruel family meeting was not finished yet. Carl suddenly lowered his voice. He mentioned a name that instantly froze the atmosphere in the room. Adrian. My stepson, the one I had spent my youth raising and eventually entrusted with the position of vice president of the company. Carl said Adrian had been making some highly suspicious moves at the office. At that very moment, while I was not even dead yet, the child I had trusted most was allegedly preparing to strike a fatal blow from behind my back and seize the work of my entire lifetime. The hospital room became terrifyingly quiet the moment Adrian's name was mentioned with suspicion. Adrian was Sandra's son from her previous marriage. I met him when he was a timid 5-year-old boy. I raised him as if he were my own flesh and blood. I paid every dollar of his college tuition. I bought him his first house when he got married. When he wanted to study business, I brought him into my logistics company and steadily helped him climb the ladder until he became executive vice president. I had given him every privilege a father could possibly give a son. But my kindness had only fattened a greedy wolf. Carl opened another file on his computer. He began reading reports from the corporate office aloud. Adrian had not visited the hospital a single time since the accident. Instead, he had been busy doing something else. He was pushing for an emergency board meeting. His goal was to rapidly liquidate the company's fixed assets. He wanted to sell off the core trucking fleet and consolidate ultimate control in his own hands. His justification was that the company needed immediate restructuring because its leader had been incapacitated. Sandra showed no surprise at Carl's information. In fact, she completely supported Adrian's plan. She said Adrian was doing the right thing. The company needed to remain in the hands of family before creditors started tearing it apart. Family. According to her definition of that word, my name was nowhere on the list. Adrian's coldness, after everything I had done for him, struck my pride like a lethal blow. He had forgotten every loan I had guaranteed on his behalf. He had forgotten that the vice president's chair he occupied had been placed there by my own hands. He was prepared to erase me while I was still fighting for breath in a hospital bed so he could sit in the chairman's seat. The betrayal exceeded the limits of what any human being could endure. I could feel my blood boiling. The rage I had suppressed for so long transformed into a dark source of energy. My body began showing small reactions. My heart rate suddenly accelerated on the monitor. The rapid beeping filled the room. Sandra glanced at the screen, but she assumed it was nothing more than an ordinary physical spasm. She had no idea that my mind had fully activated survival mode. They believed they controlled the entire game. They believed the signed DNR order would remove the final obstacle from their path. But they were wrong. My internal system audit was complete. I knew every face, every scheme, every parasite feeding on my life, and fate had granted me a second chance to turn the tables. Then at last a miracle happened, one that completely shattered every part of their plan. On the 7th day after the accident, I opened my eyes. The white light of the hospital room stung my vision. But what truly made me sick were the faces surrounding my bed. Sandra, Carl, Eva, and Adrian. They were all there. The moment the doctors announced signs of my recovery, they rushed in immediately. I saw the shock flash across Sandra's face. The mask of fabricated joy was hastily put back on. She threw her arms around me and burst into dramatic tears. She said, "Thank God for giving me a second chance at life." Carl and Eva stood beside her, eagerly joining in, claiming they had been so worried they could barely eat or sleep. Adrian stepped forward, gripped my hand firmly, and assured me that the company was stable and that everyone had simply been waiting for me to wake up and lead again. A flawless performance. If I had not heard everything they had said over the previous 7 days, I might have been moved to tears. But I was a logistics coordinator. I understood how to observe and analyze behavior. Their urgency was a symptom of panic. The DNR order no longer mattered. Their plan to divide my estate had been stopped at the gate. They were afraid I would discover the truth. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I relaxed my facial muscles. I stared at them with dull, vacant eyes. When Sandra asked whether I recognized her, I took several long seconds before slowly nodding. I spoke in a weak, fragmented voice. I pretended to be mildly confused from the effects of the accident. I asked simple, foolish questions about the date and my work. I wanted them to believe my brain had been damaged. I wanted them to think that the sharp, intelligent Matt Harris they once knew was gone, replaced by a confused 58-year-old man who would be easy to manipulate. As they watched my sluggish behavior, I noticed a subtle sense of relief in all 4 of them. They exchanged glances. Small knowing smiles began to appear. They believed they could continue their scheme under the guise of caring for a confused father. They believed they had already won. But they had no idea that my mask was the most dangerous thing in the room. This fake confusion was my passport to quietly investigate the rotten system I had built around myself. I needed evidence. I needed precise numbers to execute a complete lockdown. And the moment I was discharged and returned home, I secretly established an underground network of audits and investigations. What I discovered afterward was even more horrifying than the conversations I had overheard in that hospital room. I returned home with a cane and a sluggish gait. My family believed they were caring for a confused invalid. They freely plotted and schemed right in front of me. What they did not know was that behind the half-closed door of my study, I had already launched a large-scale investigation. I did not act alone. As a logistics professional, I understood how to leverage specialized resources for maximum effectiveness. I secretly contacted Ray, my longtime attorney, and Frank, a seasoned private investigator. We communicated through a disposable phone that I kept hidden inside a concealed safe. Their mission was simple: trace every financial transaction and every suspicious action taken by my family members during the time I had been hospitalized. Numbers do not lie. Just 3 days later, Frank sent me an encrypted file. I opened it at midnight while the entire house slept. Financial reports from the company appeared on my computer screen. My heart tightened as I reviewed the flow of funds. Adrian, the stepson I had supported with unwavering loyalty, had begun draining the company months earlier. He had created a shell company called Cooper Logistics LLC. Through that company, Adrian arranged fraudulent service contracts and inflated the cost of incoming supplies. The total amount he had embezzled reached $500,000. He had taken advantage of my hospitalization to legitimize the paperwork behind those transactions. He had even signed my name on company disbursement authorizations. His greed had left a massive financial hole in the operating system I had spent my entire life building. The betrayal of the son I had raised sent a chill through my body. But that was not the worst thing Frank uncovered. As he traced personal accounts and travel records connected to the other family members, he discovered another disgusting truth. A dark secret directly involving Sandra and the savings I had accumulated over a lifetime. The next file from Detective Frank contained a series of high-resolution photographs. Sandra appeared on my computer screen. She was not out shopping as she had claimed. She was standing in front of a luxury penthouse downtown with a younger man. His name was Scott Wheeler, her personal fitness trainer. They had been together for 14 months. While I spent my nights managing shipments and solving crises, my wife had been spending my money on her younger lover. But the deepest wound was not the betrayal itself. To a logistics professional, this was a deliberate and systematic budget leak. Sandra had used our joint accounts to purchase a luxury sports car for him. She had paid for their extravagant vacations. Even worse, Frank uncovered evidence that Sandra had forged my signature. While I lay unconscious after the accident, she had fabricated documents granting herself full power of attorney. She was quietly transferring ownership of our home into the names of herself and her lover. This woman did not merely want me dead. She wanted to strip away every dollar and every brick I had spent 30 years building with my own sweat and sacrifice. She intended to turn me into a homeless man while I was still lying in a hospital bed. I sat alone in the darkness, my fists clenched so tightly that my fingernails dug into my palms. The initial pain had disappeared. All that remained was a deadly calm. I analyzed the affair the same way I would investigate a major inventory loss in a warehouse. Sandra and her lover were toxic links in the chain. They believed they had concealed their tracks perfectly. They believed I was a confused old man who no longer had the ability to defend himself. If you've made it this far, then perhaps this story has been interesting. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far, and tell me how you think the story will end to see whether your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing so, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Every piece of evidence was now safely in my possession. From Adrian's embezzlement scheme to Sandra's affair, everything had been carefully traced, documented, and stored. The vultures believed their feast was approaching. What they did not know was that I had already prepared a very special delivery. A logistics operation of revenge had been set in motion. The truth was about to be revealed during the most important family event of all, a celebration they would never forget for the rest of their lives. I'm not a vindictive man. I'm a logistics professional. I like things to be clean, orderly, and efficient. When a supply chain breaks down, you don't sit around crying about it. You identify the faulty link and isolate it. My family had become a system rotten from the inside out. It was time for me to execute the most efficient liquidation process possible. I began preparing for the final delivery while maintaining the appearance of a confused old father. Every day I sat in the living room with a vacant stare. I allowed Sandra to spoon-feed me soup. I let Carl and Adrian openly discuss selling the trucking fleet right in front of me. But when night fell, Attorney Ray and I quietly carried out a series of legal and highly confidential asset transfers. The first target was the joint account Sandra and I shared. I silently withdrew $800,000. It was the most liquid portion of the cash reserve, the very money she intended to use to support her lover, Scott Wheeler. I transferred every dollar into an offshore trust that could not easily be traced or recovered. Sandra never noticed. She was far too confident in my supposed confusion. In fact, she did not even bother checking the account balances. Next came the new will. I signed documents revoking every previous inheritance arrangement. In the new will notarized by Ray, I completely rewrote the distribution percentages. Sandra, Carl, Ava, and Adrian would each receive exactly $1,000. The figure carried a deeply ironic message. It was enough to prevent challenges based on minimum inheritance claims, and it was enough to mock the greed that had consumed them. As for Adrian and Cooper Logistics, I forwarded the complete evidence package regarding the $500,000 in embezzled funds to the Financial Crimes Division. I requested only one thing: keep everything confidential until the exact date I specified. I wanted the strike to land when they were least prepared. I had not forgotten Carl and Eva either. I withdrew my financial guarantee on Eva's mortgage loan. I issued notice terminating Carl's employment with the parent company for ethical violations. Every step was scheduled with minute-by-minute precision, just like a delivery route that allowed no margin for error. The celebration of Sandra's and my 30th wedding anniversary was approaching. Sandra had planned the event long ago as a public display of happiness for neighbors and business associates. She had even ordered an elegant blue gown so she could shine throughout the evening. I agreed to fund every expense of that lavish celebration. I wanted every witness to their betrayal present. The stage had been built. The special envelopes had been sealed. The audience would soon fill every seat. But the most terrifying part of this reversal was not hidden inside those envelopes. It was hidden inside a surprise gift. A gift so devastating that even Sandra could never have imagined it waiting for her when she stepped onto that stage. The chandeliers in the five-star hotel ballroom shone brilliantly overhead. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the room. More than 100 guests, business partners, and neighbors alike mingled and laughed. Sandra stood at the center of the stage. She looked stunning in an elegant blue silk gown. A glass of wine rested in one hand while the other supported me as I pretended to walk slowly with my cane. Everyone applauded a marriage that had supposedly endured for 30 years. They praised Sandra as the devoted wife who had helped her husband recover from the horrific accident at the US 41 intersection. Adrian stood nearby in a tailored suit, carrying himself with the confidence of a future chairman. Carl and Eva smiled brightly, already anticipating the inheritance announcement they believed Sandra had carefully arranged. Sandra stepped up to the microphone. In an emotional voice, she spoke about love, sacrifice, and how family was life's only true refuge. I stood below the stage and watched her performance. The deadly calm within me had reached its peak. The supply chain of revenge had arrived at its delivery point. I slowly stepped onto the stage and signaled the sound technician to cut Sandra's microphone. Then I announced that I had 4 special envelopes I wished to personally present to my beloved family members in honor of this important occasion. I called Carl up first. I handed him a white envelope. Eagerly, he opened it in front of the cameras. His smile froze instantly. Inside was not a property deed. It was his termination notice from the company, along with documentation revoking the luxury vehicle the company had provided him. Carl stared in disbelief, all color draining from his face. I turned to Eva and handed her the second envelope. It contained official paperwork from the bank, informing her that I had withdrawn my financial guarantee. Unless she paid her debt, her house would be foreclosed the following week. Eva let out a sharp cry and nearly collapsed. The crowd began whispering. Confusion spread throughout the ballroom. Sandra turned pale and attempted to seize the microphone, but I stopped her. Then I handed her the third envelope. Inside were divorce papers, accompanied by a complete set of high-resolution photographs documenting her relationship with her personal trainer, Scott Wheeler. The documents proving that she had forged my signature to transfer ownership of our home had been enlarged and printed as exhibits. They scattered across the stage floor for everyone to see. Sandra stood frozen in her blue gown as the crowd stared. The image she had spent years building was stripped away in a matter of seconds. Finally, I looked toward Adrian. I did not hand him an envelope. Instead, I turned toward the ballroom entrance. The large doors swung open. 4 investigators from the Financial Crimes Division entered. They walked directly to the stage and announced Adrian's arrest on charges related to the embezzlement of $500,000 and the falsification of corporate documents connected to Cooper Logistics, LLC. The metallic click of handcuffs locking around Adrian's wrists echoed through the microphone system. He screamed Sandra's name in desperation. The ballroom became a battlefield of humiliation. The same 4 people who had once gathered around my hospital bed were now trembling, crying, and trying to gather the shattered pieces of their deception. They stared at me with pure terror. They could not understand how a supposedly confused old man had orchestrated such a devastating reversal. But my game was not over yet. The final blow was not waiting inside that ballroom. It was waiting on their phones. And it would arrive the moment I walked out the door. Adrian's screams and Sandra's sobs gradually faded behind me. I slowly walked out of the ballroom of the 5-star hotel. I never looked back, not even once. My new SUV was already running at the entrance. I climbed inside and tossed the cane onto the passenger seat. My entire system was finally clean. I drove into the night, heading north. Rain began to fall again, just like it had on the night of the horrific accident at the US 41 intersection. But this time, my mind was completely free and at peace. The phone resting on my dashboard vibrated nonstop. Hundreds of calls and messages from Sandra, Carl, and Eva poured in. They begged. They explained. They pleaded for forgiveness. I pressed send on a single group message to all of them. I heard every single word. There is nothing left to say. Our 30-year relationship is over. I'm very glad you've stayed with this story until the end. Join our community by hitting the like and subscribe buttons to enjoy more real hard-hitting stories centered around family relationships. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. This journey taught me an expensive lesson about human nature. Never underestimate the silence of a man who has spent his entire life building something. When such a man becomes silent, it does not mean he is weak or accepting defeat. It means he is observing, analyzing, and preparing for the most decisive course of action. Trust is something that must be protected, but truth is the only thing that endures. Betrayal can disguise itself with sweet words, but financial records and real-world actions will always expose the truth. True happiness is not found in the amount of wealth you possess. It is found in the people who genuinely deserve to stand beside you when your life falls apart. I lost a counterfeit family, but I reclaimed my life and my freedom. I stood in front of the gleaming glass doors of the Chase Bank. In my hands was a worn blue folder with frayed corners. The cold morning wind slipped through my thin coat, but it was nothing compared to the coldness inside my heart. I looked at my reflection in the glass. A 68-year-old man with hands covered in calluses from working double shifts for 30 years. I sacrificed everything to raise my son. But what did I get in return? After my son got married, he started treating me like an old debt that needed to be thrown away. But today inside this bank, I was about to sign a surprise gift that would leave them with nothing. Welcome to the channel Dad's Real Life Revenge. I'm Arthur. Stay with me until the end of this story because you are going to be shocked. And do not forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Everything began 3 years ago when David brought Samantha home. Back then I smiled. I thought I was gaining a daughter. At first, Samantha was as sweet as honey. She praised my garden. She promised she would take good care of David. But right after the wedding, the mask began to crack. "Dad," Samantha said as she raised an eyebrow and looked around the living room. "This house feels so outdated. The smell of old wood makes me feel suffocated. I think we should sell it and buy a modern apartment downtown instead." I tightened my grip on the coffee cup in my hand. This was the house my late wife and I built together. Every brick carried our sweat and sacrifice. But Samantha did not care. Her eyes were not looking at me. They were fixed on the wall behind me where I kept the property documents. I saw a flash of ambition in those sharp eyes. I chose to stay silent because I loved my son. I did not know that silence would become the beginning of a cruel plan. Samantha's presence in the house was like icy water, seeping into every crack of my family. She started with little things. Moving my wife's flower vase, replacing the cream-colored curtains with cold gray fabric. Then she began cutting the ties between David and me. Our joyful weekend dinners slowly disappeared. In their place came excuses about being busy, family outings I was never invited to. Samantha was incredibly skilled at isolating me. She created an atmosphere that made me feel like an unwanted stranger inside my own home. The breaking point came last Christmas. In 56 years, I had never spent Christmas alone. That morning I woke up early. I prepared pancake batter and warmed the maple syrup. I eagerly waited for Leo's laughter and David's familiar high five. But the house was frighteningly silent. I walked upstairs and found their room empty. A note was taped to the refrigerator. "Dad, we took Leo to Samantha's parents' house for Christmas. Samantha said you needed some quiet rest." David. I stood frozen in the empty kitchen. The sound of my fork touching the porcelain plate echoed harshly through the silence. For the first time in my life, the maple syrup on my pancakes tasted bitter with abandonment. I ate in the dark because I could not bear the emptiness of the room around me. Samantha had succeeded. She had turned me into a ghost inside my own home. I looked out the window and saw the neighbors' lights sparkling warmly. They were laughing together, and I was alone with fading memories. Every bite I swallowed felt like a stone pressing deeper into my chest. I wondered what David was thinking. Did he remember all the Christmases when I worked extra night shifts just to buy him the toys he dreamed of? Probably not. Samantha had brainwashed him too well. My patience had limits. I was willing to ignore everything until what happened at Leo's birthday party. That was the moment I realized this woman's cruelty had no bottom. Leo's 5th birthday party was a terrible day. I had spent an entire month working in the woodworking shop downstairs. I carefully carved each wheel by hand. I polished the body of the train with the finest natural oil I could find. It was a wooden oak train, and I had engraved Leo's name along the side with all the pride of a grandfather's heart. I wanted my grandson to have something truly meaningful, something powered not by batteries but by imagination. When I carried the gift into the room filled with shiny wrapped boxes, Samantha looked at it with obvious disgust. She did not even bother touching it. "Oh, look at that," she said mockingly. "An old dusty toy. Dad, you do realize Leo only plays with toys that meet international safety standards, right? That wood could have splinters. It could scratch his hands." I froze. David stood there, but he would not look me in the eyes. Instead, he bent down and adjusted an expensive remote-controlled airplane. Samantha picked up my wooden train using only the tips of her fingers, as if she were holding a bag of garbage. Then she tossed it into a cardboard box in the corner of the room. The box for things that were about to be donated or thrown away. "Just leave it there," Samantha said to David. "I don't want cheap junk taking up space in our son's room." My chest tightened with pain. That was not just a toy. It was my sweat, my effort, and my love carved into wood. And David stayed silent. He had completely chosen his wife's side. In that moment, I felt like a stranger interrupting the party of wealthy people who no longer needed me. Quietly, I walked away while they began cutting the birthday cake. No one noticed I was gone. I returned to my room and shut the door behind me. I sat there in darkness, feeling the collapse of the family I had spent my entire life building. Samantha did not just want my assets. She wanted to erase my existence. She wanted me to disappear just like that wooden train. The hurt inside me slowly transformed into a cold, burning hatred. I was no longer sad. I started watching. I started listening. And that was when I realized Samantha was hiding a secret far darker than her arrogance. 3 days after Leo's birthday party, my phone rang at 8 o'clock that evening. It was Samantha. Her voice over the phone sounded sweet, rustling like dry leaves underfoot. But I could feel the poison hidden beneath it. "Dad," she said softly, "David and I have been thinking a lot about your future. You've been forgetful lately. This house is far too big and dangerous for an elderly man living alone. We think it's time you had some professional financial planning." I tightened my grip on the receiver. The financial planning she talked about was really a death sentence for my freedom. She started mentioning a retirement home in the suburbs, a place she called paradise for seniors. But I knew it was nothing more than a glass cage where she could easily control everything I owned. The next morning, I quietly went to the Chase Bank. I did not tell David. I wanted to review my savings accounts myself. When I sat across from the financial advisor, she looked at me with sympathy in her eyes. "Mr. Arthur," she hesitated, "3 days ago, a woman claiming to be your daughter-in-law came here. She brought an unsigned power of attorney form and asked very detailed questions about your current balances." The blood in my veins turned cold. Samantha had already come here before me. She was not waiting for my permission. She was hunting down every dollar I had spent my life saving. She wanted to know how large the prey was before swallowing it whole. I walked out of the bank. The sunlight was bright and golden, but I felt freezing cold inside. Samantha was not just a gold digger. She was a ruthless predator. She was studying guardianship laws. She wanted to prove I was mentally unstable so she could strip away my right to control my own life. I sat down on a stone bench in the park across from the bank and watched people passing by. That was when I realized I could no longer remain a sheep waiting to be slaughtered. If Samantha wanted to play a financial game, I would show her who truly controlled the board. But first, I needed to know whether she was drowning in debt or planning something far darker. I pulled out my phone and called an old friend. "Miller, I need your help. I want you to investigate someone." The truth that was coming would hit harder than any of us expected. Detective Miller arranged to meet me at a small diner on a quiet street corner. He slid a brown folder across the table toward me. The worry in his eyes was impossible to hide. "Arthur," he said quietly, "your daughter-in-law is more than just greedy. She's standing at the edge of a cliff." I opened the file. Numbers began dancing before my eyes. Samantha owed $63,000 to a casino in Atlantic City. She had been using David's credit cards to stay afloat, but things had spiraled beyond control. The debt was growing every single day under vicious interest rates. That was why she was desperately trying to force me to sign over the house. She needed cash fast, before debt collectors came knocking at her door. But that was not even the worst part. Miller flipped to another page. This is her computer search history. Samantha had been carefully researching the symptoms of early-stage dementia. She had been looking into ways to fake medical reports and declare me mentally incompetent. If she succeeded in gaining guardianship, every asset I owned would fall under her control, and I would be locked away in some cheap nursing home for the rest of my life. Rage erupted inside me like a volcano. I had started wondering whether I truly was getting old. But now, I felt sharper than ever before. Samantha thought I was a weak old man, an easy target. She had no idea that before retirement I spent my entire life dealing with ruthless and manipulative people in business. I closed the folder slowly. "Thank you, Miller," I said. "Now I know exactly what I need to do. I would not just protect my assets. I would let Samantha dig her own grave with the endless greed consuming her soul." I returned home wearing a quiet smile. I began pretending to forget little things. I left my keys in the wrong places. I repeated the same questions again and again, and every time I acted confused I saw Samantha's eyes light up with excitement. She believed her plan was working perfectly. What she did not know was that I was weaving a massive trap, and she was the prey. My revenge began with an unbelievable number. I needed bait large enough that she would never be able to resist it. The recording device I placed on the table was actually nothing more than a garage door remote. But the truth, Samantha confessed, would destroy this marriage forever. I began my performance on a Saturday afternoon, while everyone was gathered in the living room. I pretended to search through my coat pocket for an old document. Then I muttered loudly enough for Samantha to hear. "Oh, this memory of mine. I have no idea where I put those stock certificates. And the coastal property papers, too, not to mention the trust funds. Altogether, it's worth more than $4 million. I saw Samantha freeze instantly. The wineglass in her hand tilted so sharply it almost spilled. Her entire expression changed. The usual contempt vanished, replaced by wild hunger. I could actually see her pupils widen. Even the sunlight reflecting off the broken glass outside the porch was not as sharp as the greed awakening inside her. "What did you just say?" Samantha stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You have stocks and real estate worth $4 million. Why have we never heard about this before?" I pretended to look confused. I stared at her with dull, distracted eyes. "Didn't I mention it before? Maybe I forgot. Those investments go back to when I was still working in the city. I plan to leave everything to Leo when he grows up. But lately I haven't been feeling well. Maybe I should find someone trustworthy to manage it for me." Samantha took a deep breath. Then she sat beside me and grabbed my rough, calloused hand. Her fake kindness was so exaggerated it made me sick. "Dad, you can trust us," she said softly. "David is your son, and I'll take the best care of you. You don't need to worry about those numbers anymore." I looked straight into her eyes. I could see calculations moving faster than a computer behind them. She was already figuring out how much of the imaginary $4.4 million would erase her gambling debts, and how much would remain for designer handbags and luxury vacations. In reality, I only had $200,000 in savings. But that fake fortune was the perfect bait. That entire evening, Samantha treated me like royalty. She cooked all my favorite meals. She gently tucked a blanket over my shoulders. But later, standing in the darkness of the hallway, I saw her hurriedly whispering into her phone. She was preparing the final paperwork to seize a treasure that did not even exist. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I had lifted her to the peak of hope, and now it was time to take her to visit the very place where she intended to throw me away. Samantha could not wait another second. Early Monday morning, she drove me around to visit several nursing homes she had already chosen for me. She called it a practical tour, to find the best retirement place for my future. I sat in the passenger seat pretending to doze off, but through half-closed eyes I watched every movement she made. Samantha drove with the confidence of someone who already believed she owned millions. She hummed softly to herself, as if the fortune was already sitting in her pocket. We stopped at a facility hidden deep beyond a thin forest. From the outside it looked elegant and expensive, but inside the place radiated a terrifying coldness. While a consultant guided us through the building, Samantha pulled aside the manager for a private conversation. I remained behind a thin wall and listened carefully. If I sign full power of attorney, Samantha asked in a cold voice, can you guarantee he won't be able to leave on his own? I want him under special supervision. He shouldn't have too much contact with the outside world. It could worsen his confusion. My chest tightened with rage. She did not just want my money. She wanted to erase my existence. She wanted to lock me inside a prison disguised as a nursing home, while she freely spent the money I had sacrificed my entire life to earn. I stepped back into view wearing my best dazed expression. I nodded at everything she suggested. Samantha smiled with satisfaction. She believed I was completely under her control now. All right, Dad, she said as we returned to the car. This afternoon we'll go to the Chase Bank and sign the power of attorney documents. That way you won't have to worry about managing those $4 million anymore. I'll take care of everything for you. I stared out the car window. The passing trees looked like scenes from my life flashing by. I remembered my late wife. I remembered David as a little boy clinging to my leg. And now, I was heading toward the bank for the final step of my plan. When we walked into the Chase Bank lobby, Samantha straightened my collar like a loving daughter. She whispered sweet lies into my ear about a peaceful future. What she did not know was that Detective Miller was already waiting inside the office with evidence she could never deny. The office door slowly opened. The bright neon light spilled across Samantha's glowing face, shining with ambition and greed. This was the moment every mask would finally be torn away. We sat inside the VIP office of the bank. Samantha placed the power of attorney documents on the table, her hands trembling with excitement. She pushed the pen toward me. Dad, you just need to sign right here, she whispered. All your burdens will disappear. I picked up the pen, but I did not look at the papers. I looked directly into Samantha's eyes. The greed burning inside them was terrifyingly obvious. Then I slowly placed the pen back down. I'm not signing, I said in the calmest and coldest voice I could manage. Samantha froze instantly. The smile on her face stiffened. What do you mean? She stammered. Dad, you must be confused again. Let me help you. No, Samantha, I'm not confused. And I'm not mentally unstable. I leaned closer. I know about the $63,000 debt in Atlantic City. I know about the times you sneaked into my room searching for property documents. And I also know about your plan to lock me inside a nursing home so you could steal my assets. The color drained from Samantha's face before turning dark with panic. She tried to jump out of her chair, but at that exact moment the office door opened. Detective Miller walked in carrying a thick stack of evidence detailing her attempts to forge medical records, declaring me mentally incompetent. Samantha started breathing heavily. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape. You're insane, she screamed. You can't do this to me. I'm your family, and what about the $4 million? Are you just going to let it rot? I smiled bitterly. That's the best part, Samantha. I paused. The $4 million never existed. It was bait. I wanted to see how far you were willing to go for greed. I only have $200,000 in this account, and you will not receive a single cent. If you have been listening this far and want stories like this to keep coming, hitting the like button and subscribing truly helps. 97% of people never do, but that small act is what keeps this entire channel alive. Samantha completely collapsed into the leather chair. Her usual arrogance vanished. All that remained was a pathetic woman, finally facing the truth. But her nightmare was only beginning. Suddenly, she exploded in rage and revealed her true nature completely. You manipulative old man, she hissed through clenched teeth. You think you've won? I'll take Leo away. You'll never see your grandson again. Samantha shot to her feet. She swept the folder off the table, sending papers flying everywhere, her face twisted with fury. You think you're so clever, she screamed at me. I'll destroy your life. I'll take Leo and disappear from this state. You'll grow old and die alone without ever touching a single hair on that boy's head again. I remained seated. I looked at her with nothing but pity. Then the office door opened once more. This time it was not a bank employee. David walked in. His face looked pale and exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot with disappointment and pain. In his hand was a stack of divorce papers that had already been prepared. Samantha froze completely. Her lips trembled. David, she whispered. What are you doing here? I can explain. There's no need, Samantha. David replied in a hoarse voice. I was in the next office listening through the internal speaker system. I found out about your gambling debts 3 days ago because of Dad. I didn't want to believe it. I kept hoping you would stop. But trying to throw my father into a nursing home just to steal his money is unforgivable. David placed the divorce papers on the bank table. Beside them, he set down a temporary restraining order issued by the court. You're not taking Leo anywhere, David said firmly. I've already arranged temporary custody proceedings. You should focus on dealing with your legal problems with the casino. Samantha collapsed onto the floor. She burst into desperate sobs and grabbed at the leg of David's pants, begging for forgiveness. But David stepped back. He looked at her like she was a stranger, a predator finally caught in the trap created by her own greed. I stood up and placed my hand on my son's shoulder. I could feel him trembling. The truth always hurts. But sometimes it is the only medicine strong enough to save what remains of a family. Samantha looked up at me with pure hatred burning in her eyes. In that moment she realized she had lost everything. No money, no power, no family. David and I walked out of the bank together, leaving Samantha behind with her desperate screams echoing through the hallway. The afternoon sunlight stretched long across the sidewalk outside. I took a deep breath, but our story was not truly over yet. The stormy days finally faded into the past. Samantha was forced into gambling, rehabilitation, and faced investigations for financial fraud. My house no longer carried the coldness of manipulation and deceit. David moved back in with me so the two of us could raise little Leo together. We spent many afternoons side by side in the woodworking shop downstairs. The sound of the saw and the scent of fresh oak brought peace back into my soul. Sunday dinners returned to the backyard once again. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, while Leo's laughter rang across the lawn as he pushed his wooden train through the grass. David looked at me with deep regret in his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for letting blindness cloud my judgment." I smiled and held my son's hand. "What matters is not how we fall," I told him. "What matters is how we rise together." I sat down one evening to write a new will. I still decided to leave a small trust for Samantha. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted her to have one real chance to rebuild her life after prison. I believe in mercy. True revenge is not destroying your enemy. It is living a happy life without allowing hatred to poison your heart. I watched Leo carefully holding the wooden train Samantha once wanted to throw away, and in that moment I understood a priceless truth. The richest person is not the one with the most money. It is the one surrounded by people who love them for who they truly are. Money can appear and disappear in an instant, but love, loyalty, and honor are treasures no amount of wealth can ever buy. My journey at the bank that day came to an end, but it also opened the door to a new chapter filled with hope for my family, and that is how I protected what mattered most. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. If this story helped you appreciate the value of family, share it with the people you love most. And do not forget us here at Dad's Real Life Revenge. I stood by the window looking up at the star-filled sky, and I knew that somewhere out there were still fathers suffering through injustice in silence. But remember this: the truth always finds a way to come into the light.